This is Lecture 82B, Imperialism Assaults Africa, Part 2. And just so you know how we're going through this, in the next lecture after this we'll be going through the interwar period between World War I and II and the spread of Bolshevism to Africa. But at any rate, for the moment, we'll continue with what we talked about last time. First of all, British imperialism on the Nile. Now, as you may recall, for millennia, Egypt had been the target of foreign slavocrats eager to exploit the well-disciplined labor force applied to the annually replenished Nile agricultural fields. In 1819, the Ottoman version of all of this seized Egypt, immediately imposing heavy taxes on farmers and small traders. The Turks used tax collectors from the Yaqui tribe of northern Sudan to do the dirty work. There were good and bad years on the Nile. A mafia attitude about "fuck you, pay me, or die," regardless, led many of them to flee to safer areas. In other words, whether it was a bad year, they still had to pay their new masters. In the 1870s, a Muslim cleric named Muhammad Ahmad preached renewal of the faith and liberation of the land and began attracting followers. Soon in open revolt against the Egyptians, Muhammad Ahmad proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the promised redeemer of the Islamic world. Now, I want to take a look at the Suez Canal again. In 1854 to 1856, while a French diplomat, Ferdinand de Lesseps, had obtained many concessions from Ismail Pasha, the Ottoman Khedive, or viceroy for Egypt and the Sudan, to build the Suez Canal. Now, he was never one to waste money on food for colonial workers, so de Lesseps killed some 120,000 workers over the 10 years of construction for malnutrition. In 1869, the canal was completed. Before its completion, de Lesseps' comprador Khedive, or Viceroy Ismail, borrowed enormous sums from British and French bankers at high rates of interest so he could set up his own canal service industry companies. Now, in 1873, social unrest because of Ismail's spending and corruption caused sufficient instability for the British Disraeli government to introduce an Anglo-French debt commission that assumed responsibility for managing Egypt's fiscal affairs. Ismail had appointed General Charles Chinese Gordon governor of the equatorial provinces of Sudan. Now, this was just in time for Gordon to confront the rebellion of the Mahdi boss, Muhammad Ahmad. So for the next 3 years, General Gordon fought against Ahmad and a native chieftain of Darfur, Al-Zubair Rama Mansour. Now, by 1875, Ismail's resulting financial obligations forced the sale of his block of Suez Canal shares. These shares were quickly purchased by Britain's government under its Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who took control of the management of this strategic waterway. Viceroy Ismail's corrupt spending had given Egypt a huge debt, so when his financing started to crumble, Great Britain had little choice but to step in and repay his loans. As the most direct route to India, the jewel in the British crown, control over the Suez Canal was of paramount strategic importance, and British commercial and imperial interests dictated the need to seize and control it. Thus, the ever-increasing British role in Egyptian affairs was written into stone. And then when I said that this Britain had little choice but to step in and repay his loans, it's because these loans were made by the same people that owned the British government, the same financial capitalists. So of course they were going to do that. At any rate, in 1877, the Debt Commission forced Viceroy Ismail to abdicate in favor of his son Tawfik. Now that caused still more turmoil, and Gordon found himself in trouble. In 1879, Ismail repudiated Egypt's foreign debt, giving collateral holders, Britain and France, joint financial control over the country, forcing the abdication and replacement. Naturally, this legal folderol pissed off the Egyptian and Sudanese ruling classes that had a grip on canal services. In 1880, exhausted by years of work, Gordon resigned his post and left early the next year. New governors abandoned Gordon's policies, but the anger and discontent of the dominant compradors remained. Although the Egyptians were fearful of the deteriorating conditions, London refused to get involved. Her Majesty's government are in no way responsible for operations in the Sudan, said Foreign Secretary Earl Granville. In 1881, the modest revolt took the Sudan under Muhammad Ahmad, severing Cairo's authority. That same year, Viceroy Tewfik suffered an even more perilous rebellion by his own Egyptian army in the form of the Urabi Revolt. In 1882, Tewfik appealed for direct military assistance to save his regime, and so began Britain's administration of Egypt's every aspect. In 1898, a joint British-Egyptian military force defeated the modest forces in the Sudan, and thereafter Britain, rather than Egypt, seized effective control of the Sudan as well. The French thrust into the African interior was mainly from the coasts of West Africa, or modern-day Senegal, eastward through the Sahel. The Sahel formed the southern border of the Sahara, a huge desert covering most of present-day Senegal, Mali, Niger, and Chad. The French cap's aim was to have an uninterrupted colonial empire from the Niger River to the Nile, controlling all trade to and from the Sahel region. This river trade would perfect their existing control over the caravan routes through the Sahara. So the French imperialists wanted to have a horizontal control over that part of Africa, which included not just that part of the northern part of Black Africa, but also what they already had across the Sahara Desert. The British, on the other hand, wanted to link their possessions in southern Africa, which is modern South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Zambia, with their territories in East Africa, which was Kenya, and now modern Kenya, and these two areas with the Nile Basin. So they had a north-south, a vertical highway, if you will, in mind, and of course the east, west, north, south had to cross at some point, did they not? Now, the Sudan in those days included most of present-day Uganda, and was the key to the fulfillment of these ambitions, especially since Egypt was already under British control. Cecil Rhodes made this red line through Africa famous. Along with Lord Milner, the British colonial minister in South Africa, Rhodes advocated a Cape to Cairo empire linking the Suez Canal to the mineral-rich southern part of the continent by rail. Though hampered by German occupation of Tanganyika until the end of World War I, Rhodes successfully lobbied on behalf of such a sprawling African empire. Now, Rhodes drew a line drawn from Cape Town to Cairo, and the French caps drew another one from Dakar to the Horn of Africa, which is now Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia. These two lines intersect in eastern Sudan near Fashoda, Fashoda. And I mentioned in the last lecture the Fashoda incident, and of course now you can see why that's going to turn into a confrontation. In short, Britain had sought to extend its East African empire contiguously from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope. The French sought to extend their holdings from Dakar to the Sudan, enable their empire to span the entire continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. A French force under Jean-Baptiste Marchand arrived first at the strategically located fort at Fashoda. A British force under Lord Kitchener, who had been commander-in-chief of the British Army since 1892, soon followed. After the showdown at Fashoda, the French withdrew, but continued to press claims to other posts in the region. In March 1899, the French and British agreed that the Ethiopian source of the Nile and Congo rivers should mark the frontier between their spheres of influence. In 1898, the Fashoda incident had brought the French and British empires to the brink of war. On 31 March 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm II, King of Germany, visited Tangiers and made a speech in favor of Moroccan independence, throwing down a challenge to French imperialism in Morocco that had been agreed to by Britain and Spain the year before. The French Foreign Minister, Théophile Lacasse, took a defiant line. On 15 June 1905, the crisis peaked when Lacasse was forced out of the Foreign Ministry by the conciliationist Premier Maurice Rovere. Now, by July of 1905, Germany was isolated and the French agreed to a conference to solve the crisis. Both France and Germany continued to posture up until the conference, with Germany mobilizing reserve army units in late December, and France actually moving troops to the border in January of 1906. So in 1906, the Algeciras Conference was called to settle this dispute. Of the 13 nations present, the German representatives found their only supporter was Austria-Hungary. France had firm support from Britain, the U.S., Russia, Italy, and Spain. The Germans eventually accepted an agreement signed on 31 May 1906, whereby France yielded certain domestic changes in Morocco, but retained control of important areas. On the 31st of August 1907, the Triple Entente allied the Russian Empire, the French Third Republic, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The alliance between these three powers was supplemented by agreements with Japan and Portugal. The Entente thereby countered the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the 1st of July 1911, the Second Moroccan Crisis was sparked by the deployment of the German gunboat Panther to the port of Agadir. Germany had started its attempt to surpass Britain's naval supremacy, which meant challenging the British capitalist policy of having a navy larger than the next two naval fleets in the world combined. When the British heard of the Panther's arrival in Morocco, they suspected that the Germans meant to turn Agadir into a naval base on the Atlantic. However that may have been, the immediate aim of the German move was to reinforce their claim for compensation for acceptance of the effective French control of the North African Moroccan Kingdom. In November of 1911, a convention was signed under which Germany accepted France's position in Morocco in return for territory in the French Equatorial African colony of Middle Congo, which is now the Republic of the Congo. On 30th of March 1912, France and Spain established a full protectorate over Morocco, ending the fiction of Moroccan independence. The Entente had prevailed over the alliance, that is, the UK and France had prevailed over Germany and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, the Brits encountered the Dervish. The 1884-85 Berlin Conference, which we discussed last time, regulated European imperialism's colonization and trade in Africa. The conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, first Chancellor of Germany. Its outcome, the General Act of the Berlin Conference, formalized the scramble for Africa. Essentially, the European capitalists had extinguished all forms of African autonomy and self-governance. Following the Berlin Conference, the British, Italians, and Ethiopians sought to claim lands owned by the Somalis, specifically the Warsangali Sultanate, the Ajuran Sultanate, the Gobroon Dynasty, and the Dervish Kingdom were all up for grabs. In the latter case, the Whitecaps were in for a fight. The British, Italians, and Ethiopians partitioned Greater Somalia into spheres of influence, cutting into the nomadic grazing system and the network connecting port cities with those of the interior. The Ethiopian Emperor Menelik sent an army of 15,000 men deep into the vicinity of Luke in Somalia. His troops were defeated by the Sultanate of the Geledi, and only 200 soldiers returned. The Ethiopians thereafter satisfied themselves with attacking the people in the Ogaden, stealing hundreds of thousands of their cattle. In this genocide, the British assisted. Their blockade of firearms to the Somalis rendered the nomads in the Ogaden helpless against the armies of the Menelik. The resistance against the colonization in Africa was organized by modest dervishes. The dervishes were led by Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who in his youth had traveled to the Islamic world. He returned to Somalia as a grown man and began a successful promotion of the Salahiyah order in the cities and countryside. In August of 1898, the Dervish army occupied Burao, an important center of British Somaliland, giving Hassan control over the city's wells. Hassan then succeeded in making peace between the local clans via an assembly where the population was urged to join the war against the British. In June of 1899, the Menelik regime, with Sultan neighbors and the Brits, conspired to initiate war with Hassan. The result was the religious uprising that became the Somali Dervish Rebellion, led by Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. Hassan built fortresses all over the Horn of Africa. As he moved his armies from one city to another, they had these forts for safety and training. In November 1900, Menelik proposed a joint action with the British against the Dervish. The UK capitalists agreed and sent Lieutenant Colonel E.J. Swain with a force of 1,500 Somali soldiers, led by 21 European officers, against Hassan. On 22 May 1901, Swain started from Burko with an Egyptian army of 15,000 soldiers, starting from Harar. The strategy was to place Hassan in a nutcracker, crushing the 20,000 Dervish fighters, 8,000 of whom were cavalry. Now, Hassan outsmarted his enemies, and they were defeated. Kingdom and capital. In 1913, after the British withdrawal to the coast, the permanent capital and headquarters of the Dervishes was constructed at Taleh, T-A-L-E-H, a large walled town with 14 fortresses. The main Taleh fortress was Silsilat, that occupied a walled guardhouse, and was the residence of architects, masons, and arms manufacturers. It became the residence of Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, his wives, family, prominent Somali military leaders, and hosted the Turkish, Yemeni, and German embassies. A large area to the northeast of Taleh was used for cultivation, while the Dar Ilalo towers were used as granaries. The Dervish domination of the countryside of the Somali Peninsula brought its trade routes under their hegemony. Accordingly, Hassan was able to redirect the livestock trade to the port cities of Las Corre, Il, and Ilig for export. Likewise, he controlled the customs for imports of firearms, horses, and building material. The latter was essential for the construction of several dozen modern fortresses in the Horn of Africa. The regular army of the Dervish Kingdom was organized into 7 infantry regiments. Each regiment had its own commander and varied in size from 1,000 to 4,000 men. This army was supplied with modern weapons, including rifles and Maxim guns. In addition, their equally well-armed cavalry numbered between 5,000 and 10,000 horsemen. Dervish soldiers used the Danto traditional dance song to raise their esprit de corps, and often sang it on horseback. A large paramilitary force was drawn from the nomad population to be used in guerrilla operations against the colonial armies. As we have seen, the British had been repelled in 1900. Then there had been 2 more unsuccessful expeditions against Hassan, including one in 1913, where the Dervishes had defeated British forces at the Battle of Dol Modoba. The next year, the Brits were in the Great War and focused on Europe. But following the end of World War I, the British again turned their attention to defeating the indigenous forces of Somalia. In the 1920 campaign by the British, 12 aircraft were used to support their local ground forces. Within a month, the British had occupied the capital of the Dervish state, and Hassan had retreated to the west. German caps have their problems too as the World War approaches. The Herero Wars, the Maji Rebellion. Between 1904 and 1908, Germany's colonies in German Southwest Africa and German East Africa were rocked by separate indigenous revolts. These revolts were defeated once large-scale reinforcements from Germany arrived. The Herero rebels in German Southwest Africa were defeated at the Battle of Waterberg, and German forces in the countryside defeated the Maji rebels in German East Africa. In both cases, the indigenous forces resorted to guerrilla warfare thereafter. Guerrillas are the fish in the sea of the people, so the German capitalists resorted to genocide of the populations. In total, as many as 65,000 Herero, that is 80% of the total Herero population, and 10,000 Namakwa, or 50% of the total Namakwa population, were starved, died of thirst, or worked to death in concentration camps. Most infamous, perhaps, was the Shark Island concentration camp. Typical of this genocide was the planned killing by starvation and the poisoning of people's wells when they were trapped in the Namib Desert. The Allied colonial lobby. In England, Prime Minister Gladstone, between 1880 and 1885, did not execute his electoral promise to disengage from Egypt. In France, George Clemenceau made Jules Ferry's cabinet fall after the 1885 Tonkin disaster. Still, there were more bourgeois elements in the imperialist countries opposed to what they saw as unnecessary evils of the colonial administration. But the social democratic parties that claimed to follow Karl Marx should have taken the point against imperialism, but instead, under their own pie-card traitors, they jumped on the imperialist bandwagon. Edward Bernstein and Karl Kautsky in Germany were the worst of that gang. However, right-wing socialists of the same ilk dominated workers of all the cap countries, except in Russia, where the young lawyer Vladimir Lenin led the majoritist, or Bolshevik faction, of the Social Democratic movement. Imperialism prepares for World War I. By 1900, Europe had added almost 9 million square miles, or 1/5 of the land area of the globe, to its overseas colonial possessions, that included the entire African continent, except Ethiopia, Liberia, and Sagia el Hamra. The latter would be integrated into Spanish Sahara. By 1914, Britain had taken nearly 30% of Africa's population under its control, 15% for France, 11% for Portugal, 9% for Germany, 7% for Belgium, and 1% for Italy. Nigeria alone contributed 15 million subjects, more than the whole of French West Africa or the entire German colonial empire. In 1914, Britain had the largest overseas empire. Its India colony was its single biggest possession. The French capitalists came in second in terms of surface area occupied, but much of their territory consisted of the sparsely populated Sahara. Now we come to the subject of revisionism, of the Second International, and the betrayal of the workers of the world. Between 1889 and 1914, French and German socialists of the revisionist variety had similar positions on the questions of war and peace. Then in August 1914, both countries entered the war, and in both countries, these Second International parliamentary so-called socialists voted in favor of war credits. This betrayal of the workers of Europe by the revisionist parties sent Lenin to the Bern, Switzerland library, and there he studied Hegel's dialectics, trying to figure out how the classical revisionism of Edward Bernstein and Karl Kautsky could have degenerated to this degree. Lenin already knew what to do in Russia, where he and the Bolsheviks, then headquartered in Geneva, had been masterminding their anti-war effort inside the Tsarist army and navy. After the First World War, Germany's African possessions were partitioned among Britain, France, and Belgium. Britain took a sliver of western Cameroon, Tanzania, western Togo, and Namibia. France took most of Cameroon and eastern Togo. Belgium took Rwanda and Burundi. By 1919, after the end of World War I, the reassigned colonial empires had been torn apart by uprisings. The Communist International now championed their people. And that brings us to a conclusion of Imperialism Assaults Africa. And next time we'll go into the details of the spread of Bolshevism to Africa and the rise of nationalism there.